Welcome back to the Book Log, everybody. Today I am going to be talking about Cell by Stephen King. It turns out I have been assigned the role of defending this book. Not that I think it's spectacular or one of the best books Stephen King has ever written, but because it is almost unanimously derided as one of his worst books, which I simply think is not true. Sometimes you have to be willing to meet a book on its own terms, and I think with Cell, that attitude really bolstered my enjoyment. I've read about 45 Stephen King books now, and I think that has helped me be able to kind of tap into the exact wavelength he's aiming for sometimes. And even though this book is super over the top and silly and campy, I also thought it was an incredibly fun and propulsive story. If you read this book and come away thinking that it's stupid nonsense, I can understand where you're coming from, but for whatever reason, I was just very on board with this thing the entire time. The concept here is that one day some kind of signal called the pulse is broadcast to every cell phone in the world, and everyone who hears this signal is instantly turned into mindless killer zombies that viciously attack anything in sight. Civilization quickly crumbles, and the book follows around a small group of characters as they fend for survival in the aftermath. I should mention that this book never actually uses the word zombie. Typically, people affected by the pulse are referred to as phone crazies or just phoners, but beyond that, they look and behave more or less like any regular zombie would. They're just not undead. The survivors of this disaster consist of anyone who hadn't used a cell phone that day. Part of the reason the pulse was so deadly is that in a chaotic emergency situation, people are apt to use their cell phones to check in on their loved ones, which in this case only led to even more people being affected. The book primarily takes place in the Boston metro area, and its main protagonists are graphic novelist Clay Riddell, a man named Tom McCourt, and a 15-year-old girl named Alice Maxwell. A bit later on into the story, they also link up with Charles Ardai, the headmaster of Gayton Academy, a prep school, as well as a 12-year-old student of the school named Jordan, who is kind of a wonderkin child genius. This is a very classic, tried and true Stephen King ensemble group of protagonists that link up and have to work together to overcome some major obstacle. In a lot of ways, I found this book to be comparable to The Stand. They both take place during an apocalypse scenario in which nearly the entire population is gone and the small group of survivors have to band together. The Stand operates on a much grander scale. The ensemble cast of characters is much larger, and the book deals a lot more in the aftermath of the apocalypse and the rebuilding of society from the ground up. But Cell does share a lot of its DNA, especially in the detailing of the actual collapsing of society itself and the chaos and confusion that comes with that. And in both cases, I think Stephen King does an excellent job of painting that picture. I have noticed that even people who don't like this book will at least concede that it has a strong first act, and I would have to agree. The action starts pretty much immediately, and the entire opening section is an insanely chaotic whirlwind of just ridiculous over-the-top violence. Just instant gore, phoners tearing each other apart in the streets, planes falling out of the sky and crashing into buildings. Essentially, it's just total societal collapse in a matter of minutes. Eventually, though, the story transitions more into the group adapting to their new lives and traveling up through New England in search of refuge, as well as detailing their various attempts to blow up and kill large groups of these phoner zombies. The behavior the phoners display is pretty interesting, and a lot of the details are genuinely unsettling, but the narrative also veers into some undeniably silly territory, which is, I think, where a lot of the criticism towards this book comes from. The phoners are only active during the day. At night, they cluster together and fall into a kind of deep hibernation, which is creepy. They also exhibit a kind of flocking mentality like birds and operate through a kind of telepathic groupthink. They can transmit thoughts to each other as well as to regular humans, and they seem to interact in strange ways with radio signals. One of the central ideas to this story is that the human brain is essentially a computer, and the pulse, whatever it was, acted like a hard drive wipe, stripping away memory, personality, inhibition, and humanity from the brain, and leaving behind nothing but the exposed core of the id, just like blind, unfiltered rage and violence that is always present beneath regular human consciousness. It's a bit of a pessimistic view of human nature, to be honest, and it's certainly not very scientifically sound, but there is a sort of logical consistency to it that isn't always present in King's explanations for things. I personally also appreciated the ending of this book, which King decided to leave somewhat ambiguous. All throughout the story, Clay is separated from his son Johnny and is determined to eventually find and reunite with him. Even though the chances that he is alive are very low and the chances that he's not a phoner are even lower, it's just something that Clay feels like he has to do as a father. So after he and the gang blow up another big group of zombies, he and Jordan discuss a theory. If the human brain is like a computer and the data was wiped by the pulse, maybe the original factory settings were saved somewhere deep in the system and could be restored by playing the pulse a second time. It's a bit of a convoluted idea, but he has no other option, so that's what he intends to try. So he sets off on his own. Miraculously, he does find Johnny, but it turns out that Johnny has indeed become a phoner. He's not able to communicate. He's reduced to basically a wild animal. Like, he has to be let outside to use the bathroom. He just hides under the bed all day, randomly screams in the middle of the night. The book ends with Clay placing the phone against Johnny's ear, but we're not shown what happens next. Maybe it works, maybe nothing happens, or maybe the entire reunion is just a trauma-induced hallucination and Clay is just wandering the countryside with some random zombie believing it to be his son. Like I said at the beginning of this review, at the end of the day, I think this book works well if you let it work well and if you don't take it too seriously. It's cheesy and kind of ridiculous and full of Stephen King tropes, but it has a lot of charm and it displays a lot of the things that King does really well. He knows how to create likable characters. He knows how to portray those characters in extreme situations in a way that feels authentic. He just knows how to spin a good yarn, and I am taking the brave stance that Cell is included in that. Even his books that are almost unanimously regarded as not very good can make for an incredibly entertaining product, and I think that's just the Stephen King brand. I'm gonna have to give this book an 8.